This week we're taking up the topic of curriculum issues and trends. And this presentation is going to be more brief than the others because actually there's only one point that I think we need to register beyond the discussion in our textbook. And that is the distinction between an issue and a trend. Our authors actually don't make that distinction, but I think it's one that's important to understand in our work in curriculum in public schools. Let me give you an example. Here's the definition of a trend and the definition of an issue according to a collegiate dictionary. A trend is a prevailing tendency or a movement. In other words, it's an idea that sort of seems to be the norm at the time. An issue, however, is a matter that's in dispute. We're going to make arguments for or against it. In other words, it's a debate, just like the ones that we've been having. I'll give you some examples of current trends in curriculum. First, there's standards-based instruction. Now, we might have a tendency to think that it's always been this way, but actually, standards-based instruction, I think we'd have to classify as a trend because it's only been in the last 10 or 20 years or so that so many schools, the norm, have really embraced developing curriculum around content-based standards. And of course, since we have a standards-based curriculum, we have an accompanying trend of measurement-driven instruction. And again, it always hasn't been that way. While we've had standardized tests for 100 years or more, the use of these standardized tests to base so many decisions and to make those decisions high stakes is relatively recent, just in the last 10 years or so, and so consequently I think we still have to classify it as a trend. Not quite a trend, but some people think we might be headed in this direction, would be a national curriculum. Even though states have developed their own standards, when we actually look at the content of those standards, we see striking similarities from state to state. Obviously, there are some influences behind that, national organizations and large textbook companies, but slowly we're gravitating toward a national curriculum. That would still be a trend. And even if we stop short of saying that we have a national curriculum, we certainly would have to argue that there is a centralization of decisions at the state level regarding curriculum scope, curriculum sequence, textbook adoption, and so on. For example, in California, there are only 2 publishing companies approved for reading and language arts. That's centralization, which is a relatively recent trend. Now let's look at some issues. Now I'd like us to look at some current issues in curriculum, and in this slide actually all I'm going to do is to list these issues because each one we could spend a great deal of time discussing, looking at the different aspects and developing arguments for and against each aspect. And that's really not my purpose in this slide or in this presentation. I just wanted to show you some examples of how issues will be different than trends. And remember, an issue is a matter that's in dispute. It's a question where we could take either side and develop an argument for either side. First, of course, would be bilingual education, whether we should take this approach or that approach, immersion or transition to the education of English language learners. Whether we should structure our content standards and implement those content standards through the lenses of many, many different cultures, or whether we should implement these standards through the lens of one particular culture. Those are issues. Certainly alternative assessments, which would be the different approach to using measurement-driven instruction, would be an issue, as would be the inclusion of students with special needs in mainstreamed classrooms. Now, even though the education of children with special needs has been federal law now for over 30 years, still the way we implement that, the extent to which the implementation occurs in the regular classroom is a question still at issue. And as we found out last week, character education is an issue. Not so much whether we should have character education. I think we all resolve that we should, but what particular approach we take, that is an issue. Charter schools and also vouchers are issues that are still strenuously debated in the political arena as whether they're the proper way or an effective way to go about school reform. Compulsory attendance is another example of an issue. Many people feel that compulsory attendance is sort of an anachronism from a period in history that no longer is relevant to schools today. Homeschooling would be another example of an issue, the extent to which public schools should facilitate parents who choose to homeschool their children, or whether homeschooling should be something that public schools resist. Those are issues. An example of how a trend and an issue can meet in the middle, sort of collide in a way, is the federal legislation, No Child Left Behind. This law was enacted about a year ago, and the first phase of the law, the accountability measures, in particular the feature that eventually all children will be tested in every subject every year, that clearly is consistent with the trend of measurement-driven instruction, which is based upon the trend of standards-based curriculum. But within this law are some issues, in particular the issue of the control of education gravitating from the local school board to the state legislature. Certainly we see this shift occurring, and whether it should or it shouldn't occur is a matter that still is at issue. The other aspects of the federal legislation, enhanced parental choice for parents whose children are attending underperforming schools, and the whole idea of instructional practices being grounded in scientific research. Again, this gets at some pretty weighty issues in terms of what is the right way to go about planning curriculum and implementing curriculum. What I'd like to do is to direct you to the website of the U.S. Department of Education, where you can actually get the full text of the federal law, No Child Left Behind. And this particular site provides a very handy sort of short summary of the Act. And I would recommend that you print it out and have it available when you participate in various discussions around your school. Now the next thing for us to do this week would be to go to the reading response items that I've prepared for you. And as before, those are really just my attempts to get you to think a little bit more deeply about the discussion in our textbook. And then, of course, after you finish with those, then you can enter the threaded discussion room, and we'll continue our case study discussion. And again, what we're trying to do through these case studies is to take what we have gleaned from the text materials and some of our outside reading and apply that to these situations. And as before, if you have any questions, or if I can help you in any way as you sort of prepare the final draft of your course project, don't hesitate to get in touch with me either by telephone or through email.